broadcast, and then Jan should be able to hop on. And then let me just hit record. Oh, it's already recording. And then I need to go live on. Let me go live on CAREA. Live on Facebook. Join manage. Next. Okay, so we'll give it a minute as it connects to Facebook Live. And we are going live now. So, all landlords. Okay, I think we are live now.
We're live. Yeah, I think we're live.
Okay, so it's just still loading for my Facebook page. So give me a second.
Ralph, are you still live?
Yeah. Yeah. I tried to wait.
Okay, so we
I wouldn't want to drop off in the middle of a perfectly good webinar.
Okay.
And then we have quite a few attendees on already. Perfect. Okay, so we are all set up in terms of technology. Hi everyone who's on currently at exactly 11 o'clock. Thank you so much for joining us today. So we're going to give it a few minutes for people to jump in. In the meantime, feel free to, as always, warm up our chat box. I'm going to go ahead and post our social media links, and that way you can go ahead and fill out our Google survey, join our Facebook page if you haven't already, and then follow us on Instagram or WeChat for some potential deal making. So I'll let you guys check out that, and we will get started in about just a few minutes. Right. I see Angela, Barbara, thank you, David, Daniel's on. Hey, Dexter, Estella's on, Eunice, thanks for joining, Genzo's on, perfect. Jan's on, Yen's on. You see Steve, hello and welcome. All right, give it a few minutes here. Okay, so before we get started, I'll take care of some housekeeping items. For those of you who are logging in for your computer, I know you're probably already very familiar with Zoom, but we have two areas for participating as attendees today. It's the chat box where I had sent in all of the links for our social media pages, as well as a Q&A section. So you want to save all your questions and post it not in the chat box, but in the Q&A box that Zoom has provided. And then at the end, we'll have a section for our speakers to go ahead and answer everybody's questions. And lastly, obviously, as you're jumping on, I think quite a few more people are coming on. So feel free to, again, follow our social media pages to stay current on our future events. Okay. Should we get started, Paul?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, perfect. Since we're going live, I don't want anybody to wait too long. Okay, so let's get started. Welcome to CAREA Zoom speaker event on how landlords are navigating COVID-19 challenges and utilizing the 1031 exchange to build wealth. I'm Michelle Chen, a commercial real estate broker with GD Commercial and part of this year's board of directors for CAREA. And I'm honored to be hosting today's webinar with a great friend and mentor of mine, Paul Getty with First Guardian Group, and also Ralph Bunje. Paul will be speaking on the impact of COVID-19 on rental property owners, best practices for landlords, and some very interesting 1031 exchange options to consider during our very short 1-hour webinar event. And please know, we thank you for attending. I know that there's just a lot of things going on right now with the fires and the kids being back in school and also the election coming up in November, and there's just a lot of things going on currently. So I want to take this time to really thank you for being here with the mindset of education, learning, and staying informed altogether. To briefly introduce us, the Chinese American Real Estate Association is a nonprofit organization established to promote the social and economic well-being of our associates and further the professional image of Asian Americans who are engaged in the field of real estate. We warmly welcome you to join and become one of our members. For more details, please check out our website, which is carea.org. And this event is being recorded for our members who cannot make it today and can be found online on our YouTube channel, as well as the CAREA website and Facebook. So we are live currently on Facebook. Welcome our Facebook friends who are logging in today to join us. We will also be emailing everybody the presentation and the recording the next day. So without further ado, let's go ahead and welcome Paul Getty, CEO of First Guardian Group, a full-service investment and brokerage firm specializing in the sales, investments, and management of all commercial rental property and real estate assets. Let's welcome Paul.
Hey, Michelle, thanks. You know, I'm getting a little bit of a click in the background. I don't think that's my mic, but those of you that have not muted might want to temporarily mute. So yeah, whatever that was, that went away. So maybe that was Michelle. Okay, well, thanks. Thanks, everyone. So we have a lot to cover, and I'm really, really excited to get in front of this group. A good friend of John and Jackie Luke, who actually introduced us to CAREA many years ago, and we're very, very pleased to be in front of all the professionals that we have in the audience today. Before I get into my first part of the presentation, I want to just provide 3 disclaimers and disclosures. One, we're going to be talking about real estate projections and real estate returns, and obviously real estate is not an investment that's guaranteed, so it's subject to risks. That's point 1. Point 2 is we're going to be talking about tax matters on the presentation today. Both Ralph and I are going to weigh in on not only 1031 exchange options for you guys, but also some other tax information that's pertinent and relevant, particularly to this year. Anything that we say regarding taxes should be taken up with your personal tax advisor. We can't give personal tax advice on the call today, so make sure whatever you hear today that you run it by your personal tax advisor. Lastly, we're going to be talking about some investment options that are only available to accredited investors. Hopefully all of you know what an accredited investor is, but just to recap, an accredited investor is an individual that has a net worth of $1 million or greater, excluding their personal residence, or has income if they're individual of $200,000 or more, or if they're married, $300,000 or more. So those are the 3 disclosures that I want to make before we get into the meat of the presentation. A little bit about our company. We've been in business just about 20 years. We're based in the Bay Area. Our headquarters offices are right next to the San Jose airport. We do a number of things for realtors and their clients. We are a partner with people that are working with clients, and we help realtors and commercial advisors find replacement properties for people, particularly that are selling rental properties in California and looking perhaps to reinvest those funds outside of the state. So we help folks find those properties. We also manage a good number of properties across the United States, and we've had the pleasure of working with thousands and thousands of clients since 2003 when we had our first official beginning. We've done billions of dollars in transactions, and we're licensed both in California and throughout the country to offer the various real estate options that we have. More information on companies listed on our website, which is at FGG 1031. That particular website is devoted specifically to 1031 exchange property options. So we have other websites on our commercial side as well, but that's the one I want you to focus on for today. A little bit about my background. Grew up in the Midwest. Actually, I had the benefit of having my first rental property, believe it or not, when I was 14 years old. My parents knew that I was going to go to graduate school, and in those days, it was pretty common for folks to get a rental property with the benefit being that a tenant would come in and for a few years pay down the mortgage, and then after typically 3 to 5 years, the property could get refinanced or resold, and the money that would come out of that transaction would be sufficient to pay for college education. So that's what I did. And I did my first 1031 exchange when I was 19 years old, and initially didn't like real estate, but after a couple of years, I started really getting into it. And by the time I was 20 years old, I really got the bug pretty hard. So while I was going to graduate school, I started building up a pretty substantial portfolio of single family rentals, primarily in Arizona and Nevada, and managed that until I got to be about 30 years old and got involved in some tech projects here in Silicon Valley. Continued to do a lot of real estate in my spare time, but eventually segued out of technology for the most part and have become a full-time real estate advisor to many folks both here in California and around the country. Speaking with me today is going to be a very well-known individual that I've had the pleasure of knowing for many years. Ralph, you want to cover your background a bit before we get into the presentation? Can we hear Ralph? Ralph, I think, is on mute. Can we unmute Ralph? Ralph, I think we've got you on a mute. How do we unmute Ralph? Okay, well, I guess we can't unmute Ralph.
There you go.
Hey, there you go, Ralph.
Okay, I didn't think you could mute me since I'm on my cell phone. But in any event, I started at life as, after getting out of the Navy, I joined a stock brokerage firm and was an investment advisor for many years. And then I became a CPA. And in 1978, we started our firm, and we've been going ever since. Our firm really began in the Section 1031 area right after the Starker case became case law in late 1979, and we formed Independent Exchange Services. And then in the year 2020, we are now doing not only reverse exchanges, regular exchanges, improvement exchanges, and we even do, in some cases, foreign exchanges. One of the things that people don't appreciate is that you can sell investment property located in a foreign country and trade it for investment property in a foreign country. And so we can do those kinds of transactions as well. But our specialization is really helping people make good decisions. That's our mission in life, is we just want people to make good decisions. And we're there as a resource for real estate agents and for investors. And we do a lot of personal counseling on how they should handle their transactions to make a good decision. That's really our strength. But we've been doing these things for a long time, over 40 years.
You know, we work with a lot of qualified intermediaries around the country, and the reason that we, often lean on Ralph is because of his credentials, not only as a CPA, but as a past president of the Federation of Exchange Accommodators, which is the trade organization to which most qualified intermediaries belong. So, real pleasure having you on the call today, Ralph. And if we get any hardball questions that I can't answer, we'll toss them over to you. All right, well, let's talk about navigating COVID-19. This is a moving target. Obviously, we have a long way to go before we get totally out of it, but there are definitely some real estate impacts that we need to discuss and be aware of as commercial and residential realtors. And I'll try and cover the highlights of some of those. Many of you may know that real estate asset classes have been impacted differently by COVID. The best performing asset classes that we see as we look across our portfolio, interact with brokers around the country, has been, generally speaking, multifamily. Multifamily specifically, Class A and Class B, where you've got professionals that are, even if they're not at work, they're probably at home. They're probably doing webcam stuff like we're doing right now. Basically, they're collecting a paycheck and they're paying the rent, and they don't want to get thrown out of their apartments, so they're doing just fine. The Class C apartments are typically the lower priced, older apartments where you have people that are hourly workers. You've got hairdressers, nail salon people living in those types of places. And of course, many of those people are impacted and in many cases are not paying rent. So that's a challenge for the Class C apartments. But Class A and Class B have been holding very, very steady. And for our clients that are realizing income from those properties, they're generally doing very, very well. We have some payment plans in place selectively, but by and large, they haven't seriously impacted returns. The next category that's doing quite well are the industrial, warehouse, and manufacturing and distribution properties. Amazon, as an example, is a great example of that. We have many Amazon facilities that we look at across the country, distribution warehouses, very large complexes, and they're sprouting up like crazy because more and more of us are buying stuff online. Great asset class to get into. It's a bit expensive to invest in industrial properties today, but if you can find them and get them at a good price, it's a great place to invest, and they're pretty much COVID proof. Self-storage has turned out to be very, very recession resilient. People are reluctant to get out of self-storage if they have put some valuable items in there. A lot of companies that have partially shut down or having people work from home have moved some of their equipment into self-storage. So we're seeing a little bit of a mini boom in self-storage around the country as well, and that asset class is holding well. Healthcare, mixed bag. For urgent care centers and people that are involved in doing COVID testing are generally doing pretty good right now. But as you know, a lot of discretionary healthcare, plastic surgery is an example, but even getting other discretionary healthcare is suffering right now because people are reluctant to go to the doctor unless they really need to. And in many cases, doctors are reluctant to see people in person. I know I had a physical recently, and I did it online, which is kind of weird, but that's what we're all doing these days. So a little bit of a mixed bag in healthcare. The asset classes that are not performing, probably number one is hospitality. We see hotels really in a slump. Hotels near areas where people are visiting. If you're going to Yosemite and you want to stay at the hotel there, the Iwani, you're going to have a hard time getting a room. But if you're going, let's say, to Seattle or Portland or New York, the hotels there, which rely traditionally on business travels, are pretty much dead in the water. Occupancy rates are 10, 15, 20%, not the 60, 70, 80% that we normally see. So hopefully when COVID gets past us, we'll see a resumption of activity. But right now, hospitality is obviously an area that a lot of investors are avoiding pretty significantly. Discretionary retail is another category. There's a lot of stuff that people do when we don't have COVID that they're not doing now. If you're not a grocery store, if you're not a necessity retail, you're probably hurting. You're probably laying off people. And so we are very reluctant to recommend retail investments. There are some exceptions. Again, if it's a grocery store in a good location, probably going to be okay. But if it's a small mom and pop nail salon, as an example, or other forms of retail, those are hurting right now and are not on our recommended list. A lot of commercial companies are seriously rethinking, not only in the short term, but in the long term, what they're going to do with the lease space that they've had. We've seen significant initiatives announced from companies like Adobe, Amazon, Facebook, and others, where they are allowing their employees to permanently work from home. What they were discovering is that people working from home can actually be more productive because they're not commuting back and forth. You're in the Bay Area, not unusual to commute, an hour to work each way, so you blow 2 hours in a car. Now, if you can spend that time in front of your computer at home and do the work that you were assigned to do, you may be better off. Significantly, we are seeing the beginning of a move of companies to renegotiate leases that they've had because they find that they don't need the space that they thought they needed. A big deal went down last week that you may have heard about. Pinterest basically paid almost $90 million to cancel a lease on a new San Francisco office complex that they had previously committed to. So $90 million to get out of that lease because they just don't need the space anymore. And it's not just because of COVID, it's because they discovered that they get more productivity out of having their employees work from home. Pretty interesting stuff. Student housing, not doing well right now. We don't know really with the student housing that we see around the country if kids are going to stay at school. A lot of universities want kids to come to school because obviously they're going to get more income if people are in school than if they're not in school. And it is tough to do distance learning for a lot of things that people go to school for. But student housing right now is another area that the future remains unclear on until we get past COVID. Let's talk about COVID impact on migration trends. The picture that I'm showing you on the right hand of the slide, if any of you have gone to San Francisco recently, you've probably seen a lot of U-Haul trucks. Why is that? Well, both San Francisco and New York are losing people. And we're seeing an impact on rental rates. This is quoted from Zumper just a week ago. Both San Francisco and New York have reached the lowest rental rate since 2014, down about 7% in San Francisco. Also, money-wise, this is a great article if you have a chance to read it. It ranks areas to leave and areas to go to. San Francisco, unfortunately, is rated by MoneyWise as the #1 city to flee from. New York is #2. That's pretty sad state of affairs. Top cities that people are moving to, and this is in order that they've listed them: Sacramento, Atlanta, Phoenix, Portland, San Diego, Miami, Austin, etc. These are the cities that are benefiting from the flight from the larger urban areas around the country. We're also seeing areas in California. Seaside is an example. I understand that the residential property values have gone up 20% in Seaside, which is, you know, is a community adjacent to Monterey. So that's amazing, and a lot of that is due to flight from San Francisco. There are some legislative trends to be aware of that are impacting real estate as well. This is a big deal. We see national and statewide eviction moratoriums that are really creating a headache for landlords. We find that now landlords are in a very tough position where they still have to make mortgage payments, they've got to pay utility bills, they've got to pay taxes, but their tenants can pretty much say we can't pay rent, and the normal recourse that a landlord has to evict somebody has now been taken away by the governments. So both national and statewide eviction moratoriums are making it very difficult for landlords, particularly in Class C properties or in mom and pop retail, to collect rents. California has extended a moratorium on evictions, and they just actually re-extended it to February 1st of next year. So pretty scary times if you've got tenants that don't want to pay, and honestly, some tenants are just using this as an excuse to not pay, and the landlords can't really do anything about it. The growing California state deficit that we have now, which is approaching 60 billion plus, is also adding tremendous pressure to raise taxes in the state of California. There is a proposal afoot to hike our top marginal rate from 13.3% all the way up to 16.8%, and it's creating shudders among wealthier Californians who, many of whom are in our client base, that are talking to us almost on a regular basis about moving out of the state. Secondly, this is a real scary state of affairs. I don't think it's going to pass, but this is a wealth tax that's been proposed whereby people that have a net worth, and it's everything they own, boats, cars, whatever, is going to be taxed if this thing passes, which I don't think it will be, but it's a proposal to basically charge wealthy people a wealth tax on all of their net worth, in this case of 0.4%. Europe had something similar to this, did it for a few years and found that their wealthy people simply left the countries and went elsewhere, and that's what a lot of people are predicting would happen in California if this measure passed. But it is proposed and it's out there, so it's something to kind of be on the lookout for. There are 2 ballot measures that we're going to be seeing coming up in November that you should be aware of. This is a scary situation. Every year over the last few years, there have been initiatives to basically compromise Prop 13, which has been, one of the most powerful things that we have in California for protecting property owners against rising taxes. However, this proposal, if it passes, and it's definitely gaining momentum, would require commercial and industrial properties to be taxed at market value. So Prop 13 for commercial and industrial is going to be gone. Residential properties would not be impacted by this particular proposition, but because of the state needing taxes, there are a lot of lobby groups in favor, and you'll see a lot of ads coming out in the next few weeks encouraging people to vote in favor of Prop 13, which will Proposition 15, which will eliminate the Prop 13 tax breaks for commercial properties. Proposition 21, also very scary for landlords, would cap rent increases at 5% on housing that is 15 years and older. And it would also impact those of us that own portfolios of single-family properties where we have more than 2 rental properties in our portfolio. So previously, owners of single-family rentals were not really impacted by some of the rent caps that we've seen. Proposition 21 will change that if it passes. And I think this is probably 50-50, but it's out there, and it's something that we need to be on the lookout for as real estate professionals. The impact is that there's a growing number of real estate investors that we talk to on a daily basis, and I'm sure many of you in your networks also encounter this. Many, many more people are talking about moving their equity out of the state of California. It's becoming almost a tidal wave at this point. I'll have more to say on some of those subjects. I'm sure we'll have some questions come in. I'd like to turn things over to Ralph Bunje, who's going to go over some basics in the 1031 exchange. Most of you should be somewhat familiar with this, but there's some new things that have just recently changed as well in the 1031 exchange area that I want Ralph to touch on as well. So Ralph, why don't we have you take it away? Why don't we start with a recap of your firm and what you guys do?
Sure. Our primary business is independent exchange services. We established it in January of 1980. We provide 1031 exchange intermediary services for doing delayed exchanges, simultaneous exchanges, reverse exchanges, build-to-suit exchanges, and international exchanges. If you go to the website of www.1031pro.com, you'll find out a little bit more about us and ways to contact us directly whenever you have questions. We have an office in San Francisco, one in Hayward, which is our headquarters office, and one in Bakersfield. We have 6 partners, and we're happy to help you anytime you have a question. You should always feel free to call us. There's never any charge for that. I mean, it's just a case where we're here as a resource to back up your efforts to get a Section 1031 exchange designed and fit together for your client. So we're here. Just always feel free to call. It's just that it's that simple. Now, if you go on to look at what is a 1031 exchange, that really allows to trade into or out of a property that is held for investment purposes or a trade or business property. So that you might have an office or an office condo, you might have a retail store, and you want to trade into another investment property like an apartment house when you retire, or you want to trade into another trade or business property, you're free to do so. I think there's a list on the next slide that I was talking about our tax savings. But if we look at the total savings that you can get when you make up, you sell your property, you've got to look at what the sales price is. You need to subtract the all of the sales costs, the commissions and closing costs, and then look and say, well, how much is my gain when I subtract my cost basis? Well, you have federal capital gains tax up to 20%. You could have 3.8% Obamacare tax. You could have recapture of depreciation that you've taken over the years of 25%. And you could be in California up to a 13.3% rate. So there's a lot of tax involved in doing your transaction. The advantage of doing the 1031 exchange is that you can transfer your cost basis into the new property that you buy. And then you can defer all the taxes for the time being. And only until you finally sell that property. One thing you have to be careful or at least be reminded of is that California says if you sell a California property and you do a 1031 exchange, say to Nevada or to Georgia or to some other state, you have to continue to report on your on a special form the fact that you still own the property. Because at some point in time, if it turns out you sold the property, you'd be subject to state taxes in the state in which the property is located. But then California would say, well, some of that gain belongs to us, so we want our tax on that one. So you have to remember when you trade to something out of state, you have to report on it annually to California. Now, typical like-kind properties are all the ones that Paul mentioned. Multifamily, healthcare, self-storage, retail, student housing, industrial, single family, duplex, triplex. You can go from any type of property to any type of property. There's no limitation on the type of property. It's really how you use it that makes the difference. In other words, if you have a second home and you want to trade out of it, wow, you have to pay the tax. But if you were to hold it as an investment property and not use it as a second home, you could then sell it as a 1031 exchange and defer the tax. But if you sold it when it was a second home, you'd be stuck. Similarly, let's say that you decided to trade out of an investment property and you wanted to locate, say, down in Arizona, and you went down to Arizona with an investment property and you rented it out for 2 years. You could convert it to a single family residence for yourself. It could become your personal residence. You even have a situation where if you were selling your highly appreciated California property that you had been living in, if you rent it out for 2 years, and then in the 3rd year, you can sell it. And if you lived in it 2 out of the last 5 years, you get a Section 121 exemption for a personal residence, and you could do a 1031 exchange for the rest. So there are ways of working the system once you understand what your situation is. And that's what we do, is we help you determine what the right way to go is. But you can't just trade into a primary residence. You can't trade into a second home. You can't be a flipper, where you buy a property in order to sell it, you do some improvements on it and sell it. Or you're a developer. Let's say you're building an apartment house and you're selling units in the apartment house. That wouldn't qualify for exchange. That's considered ordinary income. It's considered inventory as opposed to being a capital asset. And it's only capital assets that qualify for investment property. Now, when you look at your exchange rules and you don't want to pay any tax, you look at the value of the property. Okay, so you look at your relinquished property, and the value is your net sales price. That's your gross sales price less the commissions and closing costs and those things. And that gets you down to your relinquished property's net sales price. If you want to have a tax-free exchange under 1031, well, then you'd want to do a replacement property that's either equal to or greater in value than the net sales price of the property itself. If you trade down below that, you would have a gain on the amount of the trade down that you'd have to pay tax on. Your equity has to also be invested in the property. So after you pay off the debt, then you'd have the equity left over. We call that your exchange credit. And that exchange credit must go into the new property as a down payment. Now, let's say that you traded up on the value, but you took out some cash and didn't put all your equity in, well, then you'd pay tax on that amount of the cash that you took out. Now, it says, you think of mortgage relief, and it's a little hard to see the thing over there because the pictures are in the way. But when you pay off your debt on the property that you sell, you have to take on an amount of debt equal to or greater than the amount of debt you were relieved of. Now, obviously, if you trade up, you get more financing, and that's a good way to take care of it. But on the other hand, if you wanted to have something free and clear, you could do that. And you do that by adding cash out of your savings account and pay down the debt effectively when you buy the new property. So you could actually be free and clear and not have to worry about your debt simply by adding cash to your transaction. So what we try to remember is to always remember the formula: equal or up the net sales price and equal or up the equity, because you're automatically then equal or up the debt. And that's the financial structure rule, and that's basic to doing a 1031 exchange. Now, the tricky one, and that applies particularly for those of you over 40, the reason for that is that when you're over 40, time passes faster for people that are that age, I can tell you for a fact. And what we have to do is in 45 days following the close of escrow, you have to identify in writing to the intermediary, and that's what we are, we're a qualified intermediary. You have to identify that the properties you're going to buy. And then from that, and within that a total of 180 days, you have to have closed escrow on it. So you usually have plenty of time to go ahead and complete your exchange and get your financing, even though lenders are a little slow to react today because of COVID. You still have plenty of time to get your property put together. But the key is the 45-day rule. Once you have identified your properties, then you're stuck with those after the 45th day. The detailed rules on those, I'm not sure what happened there. The screen is blank. Well, this is something we didn't get into. The slide's a little bit out of order, but if we had a situation when the COVID thing came back that on April 1st, 2020, you could have, if you closed your escrow, you could have an extension. That was just because it was related up until July 15th. Now, recently, there have been all these fires in California, and there is a revenue procedure that covers cases where, because of the fire and you're living in a covered disaster area, and you sold rental property and it was transferred to a new buyer around August 14th of 2020, you might be able to get an extension out to December 15th for a 45-day identification or the 180-day period. The disaster areas include Lake County, Monterey, Napa, San Mateo, Sonoma, Yolo counties. Others may be added. We're not sure how this is all going to go, but they do think through these things when a disaster happens, and it all evolved out of the Katrina disaster years ago, and they created a revenue procedure to extend the periods of 45 and 180 days. You should always try to meet the 45 and 180-day period. That way you're always safe. Now, the three rules for doing an identification, the three property rule. The taxpayer may identify up to 3 properties of any fair market value. So you could sell something for $100,000 and identify up to $20 million of properties so long as there are only 3 of them. However, a lot of people might have a very large property and they want to have a number of smaller properties. And this particularly works for DST identifications, where you're trying to put together a portfolio of DSTs, to replace the property that you have. And that's where we run into the 200% rule. And that's where you can identify more than 3 properties, but you have to take 200% of the gross sales price, not the net sales price, but the gross sales price of what you sold. And then you take that, so if you sold for $1 million, you could identify properties worth $2 million or less. But you have to then identify by putting up the gross purchase prices of all the properties that you list so that you're actually within the 200%. So you're limited only by the values. I don't know why they made this rule, but for whatever reason, they thought this was pretty cool and they put it into play back in 1984. The 95% rule, it just says that if you put in, more properties than you were allowed to, and you bought all of them, basically, then you could meet the test. But not many. In 40 years, we've never really seen anyone use the 95% rule. Typically, it's going to be the 3 property rule and the 200% rule. And the 200% rule also is useful if you're trading in a bunch of small properties because you have a number of heirs that you want to be able to give properties to on your departure.
Okay, Ralph, we're going to come back. I'm sure there's going to be some questions on some of the items that you've covered, particularly on the residential property exclusion that you alluded to in one of the slides. That's a pretty interesting thing that we should maybe talk about a little bit more. I'm going to now shift back into the presentation and talk about some of the exchange options that some of you may not know about, and even if you know about them a little bit, it's good to kind of recap them. One of the most difficult things to do in an exchange, as Ralph kind of suggested, is to find replacement properties within that 45-day period. It's a real killer, particularly now with COVID. People are not traveling. People are reluctant to have strangers come to their properties. And if you're thinking about buying something out of state, you're going to probably be inclined to want to go visit it. How do you go do that? Do you get on an airplane and maybe risk getting COVID, or stay in a hotel in some strange area? So it's a challenge. So one of the ways that a lot of folks are beating that challenge is that they're taking a serious look at a Delaware statutory trust replacement property option. And what is this? This is simply another way of owning properties where you can have up to 2,000 people basically pool their money together, and a trustee would then manage that property on their behalf. That's why it's called a trust. And each investor would have a fractional ownership percentage of that property that was owned by them and all the other people that are in it. This was allowed back in 2004 by the IRS to be a 1031 in, 1031 out vehicle. So this is pretty cool because this is a way in which you could find a property to do the 1031 exchange, and then when the property is sold in the future, you could do another 1031 out the back end. A lot of other trusts don't have that degree of flexibility, but the Delaware Statutory Trust does. Minimum investments are typically as low as 25 for exchanges. They may have a minimum of 100,000, but way less than what a typical California property would cost. So one of the cool things about that minimum is that you can mix and match DSTs with traditional real estate. And also, if you needed like a certain amount of a DST to fill out the requirements that Ralph put out earlier, let's suppose you're buying a traditional piece of real estate, but you have some extra money that has to be accounted for, some additional debt that wasn't used up, or maybe you're selling something for $1 million and you're buying a new property for 800,000. As Ralph mentioned, you're going to have a tax consequence if you don't exactly follow the rules that he outlined. But DSTs can plug that gap because we can sort DSTs out and chop them up even down to the penny if we need to do that. So that's a pretty powerful option. DSTs typically have a cash flow of 5 to 6%. Sometimes a little bit lower, sometimes a little bit higher, that is paid monthly. And that's a net cash flow, net of all property operating expenses. So it's a pretty cool way of getting cash flow on the equity that we've accumulated in properties, which in California, we often don't get cash flows of that amount. Any loan that would be on the DST is not the responsibility of the investors, it's the responsibility of the trustee. So as a result, when you invest in a DST, you don't have to submit any loan qualification statements. You're not a guarantor on the loan. That's the responsibility of the trustee. So it really streamlines the process of qualifying and getting into a DST. They can close very quickly. All DSTs that we offer are already up and running. You're already generating cash flow. And if you invest today, typically within 30 days, you're getting your first check because all these properties are up and running. You're not waiting for other investors to come in. The trustee owns the property. They're simply reselling their interest to you. You invest, you get a check. It works out pretty easily. At the end of the year, you get a very traditional, basically schedule. Typically, it's called a 1099 replacement form, which looks a lot like an income statement, but it's something that you can very easily translate over to your normal real estate Schedule E. And with the Schedule E, you can obviously take additional deductions on that, depreciation, interest, and other related personal expenses on the investment can be written off on the Schedule E, which makes it pretty powerful in terms of being able to tax shelter the income that you're getting from the DST. I mentioned earlier that some of the investments that we're going to be talking about, and this is one of them, DSTs, are only available to accredited investors. Unfortunately, here in the Bay Area, most of our real estate investors meet this test, but some do not. So it's something you need to watch. Potential DST benefits, there's a full tax deferral that we talked about. The trustee is on the hook for the loan. You're not as an investor. Cost savings are pretty significant. You don't have to have any special purpose LLC or entity set aside. You can invest as an individual. So there's no really ongoing costs that you need to worry about in the management of the DST. All that cost is taken out, and your projections that you're looking to get have already been netted out against those ongoing costs. You can close within days, making them ideal, not only for the 45-day identification, but also as a backup. So those of us that have a primary property that we really are thinking we're going to get into, it costs nothing to add a DST or 2 or 3 to that backup list. There's no extra charge for doing that. And it gives you an insurance policy that if your primary property can't close, you now have effectively kind of an insurance policy that you're going to close on some properties and avoid what could be maybe a pretty large tax bill. Due diligence and loans are completed on DSTs. Typically, when you see a DST offering, you're going to see a marketing brochure, but right behind that, you're going to get a couple 300 pages of due diligence materials, videos, a lot of other information. And many of our investors actually invest in DSTs without even physically visiting the property because the due diligence is sufficiently complete that they're comfortable doing that. We personally like to visit properties, but we have a lot of busy investors that really review the due diligence and make their investment decisions based on the information that's provided. And we've seen historically reliable cash flow. DSTs have been around since 2004. We as a company did not begin recommending them until 2011, which was past the last great recession that we had. I wanted to see how they would perform in the worst of times or in tough times. And we saw DSTs, particularly the apartment DSTs, which are really the most preferred of all the assets that we typically see people getting into. They have stood up and continue to stand up in these COVID times relatively well. Trustees make all the decisions on DST, so we don't have a situation where investors are fighting with each other about decision making. The trustee is a property management firm that makes all the decisions on behalf of the investors. And we've talked about the lower minimums, which give you an opportunity to diversify as well, which is, again, a very powerful risk mitigation strategy for a lot of our investors. Restrictions are, well, some folks don't like the concept of a trustee making all the decisions for them, and that's, I guess, a potential negative in investing in a DST. It also makes it very important that when you invest in a DST, the most important thing you need to look at is the background of that trustee and that property management company. Because if they're new to the game, or they haven't done what they say they're going to do with you before, or not many times before, you got to put a question mark on the projections and the expectations that they're setting, and they may not perform for you if they historically haven't done so. The interests in all real estate are not liquid. The time of the sale is generally set by the trustee. There are opportunities to get out of DSTs early, and I could take that discussion offline with any of you individually that have an interest in exploring how to get out early, but that's something that we occasionally help folks do. The properties all must be fully reserved up front. This is another thing that's pretty cool, because as an investor, sometimes in real estate, we have to put additional money in properties as time goes on. And sometimes we receive a notice of a capital call. Maybe there's a requirement for a new roof, or in COVID times, maybe an unexpected vacancy has created a situation where we now are asked to write another check. DSTs basically have to be capitalized with reserves set aside up front to really cover all of those unexpected items that are likely to come up: a new roof, a new parking lot, air conditioning, et cetera, et cetera. So that the trustee can't, in general, go back to the investors to ask them to put any more money in the property. All cash must be distributed on a current basis, so the trustee can't hoard cash. At the end of the year, all the cash that's available for distribution must be delivered in that year back to the investors. And the trustee is also limited in the types of things that they can do with the investments that they make in the property. There's been a big trend in California towards DSTs. I've seen some statistics that say that of all the DSTs that are done in the country, upwards of 35 or 40% of all DST investments are made by California investors. I think that's probably driven by the high taxes that we're all paying, and also the high amount of appreciation that many of our rental properties have benefited from. People simply don't want to pay the tax, and they don't have a place to put it. So when they come to sell a property, DSTs have really become increasingly a go-to option, and we have a lot of history, thousands and thousands and thousands of transactions that we can look to, and literally millions of investors that have gone the DST route since 2004. The most popular asset class in DSTs is multifamily. It's basically those asset classes that have not been impacted, by recessions or by COVID. And I outlined those in my earlier slides. But storage, necessity retail to some degree, industrial, these are the assets that really are the go-to options for investors seeking DSTs. So I'm going to go through a few summary slides. Michelle, maybe you can jump back on and take some questions. I wanted to put some takeaways from you and not just kind of talk and educate, because I think it's important for all of us to be on top of our game and understand that we're going through a very dynamic time right now. None of us have ever been through a year or could have predicted the year 2020. I mean, a year ago, I don't think any of us could even spell COVID, and here we are in the middle of COVID-19. So what are the takeaways? In the midst of every crisis lies a great opportunity. Okay, that's an old statement. You've probably heard variations of this. I think Albert Einstein was credited with saying it for the first time many years ago, but it's true. And so what does that mean for all of us? As real estate professionals, let's study and take advantage of changing strategic trends. Don't react to something that may be only a temporary type thing, but I think that there are things that are happening right now, specifically the movement by big companies to allow employees to work from home. That's something that we've talked about for many years, but it actually has happened this year. And many large employers, as I pointed out earlier, are revamping the way that they're looking for the rest of their existence on how they're going to react and interact with their employees. And we need to adjust our real estate strategies to some extent strategically to take advantage of that. So learn where transactions are increasing and consider adjusting your business plans accordingly. Obviously, commercial leasing is being impacted right now. If you want to put more time into commercial leasing, is this the best time to be doing that? Answer is maybe not. follow shifts in geographic preferences. So another significant trend, it didn't start with COVID. COVID has accelerated it, but we have seen a significant move of investors redeploying capital outside of California because COVID aside, California is just not a landlord-friendly place anymore. There's rent control, there's prohibitions on evicting tenants, and there are much more landlord-friendly areas around the country, places like Colorado, places like Texas, places like Tennessee, et cetera, are areas that are benefiting from California investors redeploying capital in those target markets. Target asset classes that are most likely to be in highest demand. So if you're in the business right now, I know a lot of commercial realtors that focus on hotels. They're starving right now because nobody's doing any hotel transactions. Stick to areas that are likely to be working well, not only during COVID, but begin to develop a post-COVID business plan, because there are changes that I think are going to be systemic and strategic that we as realtors and advisors need to take advantage of and augment your personal skills and expand your network by partnering with others. The most successful realtors and advisors that we work with are people that bolt us into their team. They're people that work with Ralph, that work with myself, basically as an extension of what they're doing. So don't be a lone ranger. Basically bring us into your team. We partner and we work with agents throughout the country and apply your personal skills and combine resources to solve the most pressing problems of your clients. We talk with clients on a daily basis, and we're constantly tuning our strategies and tactics to fit the pain spots that people are having. And right now, a big pain for a lot of people has to do with issues that are coming down in the state of California, causing them for the first time to consider moving capital out of California. And if you can become a good source of information about that trend, that's one significant trend that I think all of us should get more familiar with so that we can be more expert about guiding our clients with those issues. Next steps, team with FGG if you need help with rental property owners that you're working with. We don't typically get involved in the sales of individual residential properties. I'm going to have Ralph talk a little bit more about converting individual properties into rental properties to save some money. We work more on the rental property side, on the side where people can take advantage of things like 1031 exchanges. We also have a very large network of real estate tax advisors and CPAs that we work with, estate planning people that we work with, and if you need them, we have real estate legal resources that we can work with. We don't charge any fees for that. It's basically a service that we provide, and like Ralph, we're here 7/24 to take questions from anyone at no charge to assist with decision making and strategy setting. Ralph's team, as you mentioned, is located throughout the state, but primarily here in the Bay Area. And I think I want to also, maybe before we go to questions with Michelle, just point out that I'm really pleased to have written a book that a lot of people like. It's on Amazon, I think for about 20 or 30 bucks, but it's also available for free by simply contacting us at the information, the phone number or info@FGG1031. Just finished an audio book that is doing really well on Amazon, but the link that I can send you would also have a free version of the audio book. This is now a best-selling book in the United States on DSTs and 1031 exchange principles and concepts. So I'm going to put that up just for a second. Michelle, what questions do we have coming in?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you, Ralph, for all this great presentation and information. I'm going to mute you guys for just a quick sec here. Okay, so outside of CAREA on a personal business level, I've worked with Paul and Ralph for several of my own clients over the years, and often we're able to double, triple, or sometimes quadruple a landlord's rental income and increase their tax shelter through the 1031 exchange. So as a real estate professional myself, I do see the value of what Paul and Ralph can bring to the table to allow my clients a very, very good 1031 exchange replacement property options through the DST or Delaware Statutory Trust for passive rental income outside of California. And so for your clients who may want to consider investing in more landlord-friendly states, I do highly recommend you reach out to Paul and his team directly. I'll go ahead, and I see we have Paul and Ralph's information already. Paul, do you mind clicking through the last page of the slides with your guys' contact? Oh, I think it should be, yeah, there we go. Perfect. So go ahead and maybe jot down their information. We will send out the slides with Paul and Ralph's info as well. So let's go ahead and start on the Q&A. I'm going to unmute our speakers. Oh, it's not listening to me. If you guys can unmute yourselves, that would be great. Perfect. So Angela is asking our first question. Is that net worth of $1 million for DSTs in liquid assets, or can it be properties you own?
Okay, I'm not sure I understand the question. Can you rephrase it?
Sure. It's basically the qualifying aspect of being able to be an accredited investor. Does the $1 million for DSTs to invest in a DST need to be in liquid assets, or can it be in properties that you own?
No, so I think it's important to look at that qualifier as everything that you own, with the exception of your personal residence. A quick little story. I'm working with a guy in Los Angeles, and he's right on the edge of being accredited. He sends me, kind of a statement, and he said, Paul, I'm not quite there. I'm at like, $800,000, $900,000. And I started asking him a question. I said, well, what else do you own? And he said, well, I know, I got some hobbies, but my wife is a collector. And I said, well, what does she collect? And he said, well, she collects shoes. I said, shoes, right? Yeah, shoes. And so it turns out that she collected shoes of Hollywood stars. She was down in Los Angeles. And so I asked the obvious question. I said, well, what's the shoe collection worth? He said, Paul, I think it's worth about $300,000. I said, go away. But it was. They had it appraised and they had it insured. And she's like the Emil DeMarcus of, movie stars shoes. And so that got them over $1 million. I had a guitar player that worked with us, again, down in Los Angeles. And he had a vintage guitar collection that was worth, a couple $100,000 and wasn't considering that as part of his net worth. So there's a lot of stories that we hear. We can't fudge the numbers. If you're worth $999,000, you don't qualify. So we can't fudge the numbers. But I think a lot of people in California, because they've invested in real estate, are accredited. It's rare that we run into people that are not. But we do see those every once in a while. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Paul. Yeah, so basically it doesn't have to be liquid, right? So it could be residential rental properties or commercial rental properties, including all other items of value.
Yeah, boats, cars, gold, silver, shoe collections, you bet.
Thank you. Okay, our next question is, can you do a DST from California rental property to a Florida DST for apartments?
Yeah, I think Ralph mentioned, the 1031 exchange is a U.S.-wide.
Domestic to domestic.
Yeah, and you can also do it internationally as well. I think Ralph kind of touched on it. You can, you can't sell in the U.S. and reinvest internationally, but you can, if you're in Canada and you got a rental property, you sell one in Canada, you can get another one in Canada. So there's a lot of flexibility, and you can go from state to state. The only thing you need to watch out a little bit about are the tax consequences of investing in certain states that have taxes. We only have, I think, 7 or 8 states in the country that do not have state income tax, as an example. They're maybe, for some investors, a little bit more desirable. Places like Texas and Florida and Nashville stand out. Washington State doesn't have state income tax. So something to consider, but we can walk you through that. It's not a big deal to file taxes at the end of the year. You get a credit, typically on your California return, but it's a little bit more work that we need to go through. Easy to do in TurboTax.
Thank you. Angela has another great question. When you go from a residential rental to a DST, what happens to the paid off debt? If you replace it with a rental, you have to have equal or greater debt. So with DSTs, do you have that debt?
Yes, you do. You take on the debt that's organized as part of the DST, unless you're buying an all equity DST, in which case that might be a problem. But if you're buying a DST with a loan on it, that loan automatically offsets the loan that you had on the property that you sold.
I want to maybe mention one thing that we didn't bring up. We have a lot of investors that that have no debt on their property. And I know, Michelle, when we were working together, particularly a lot of our Asian investors, they don't like debt. So what do? If you're selling a property for $1 million and you want to get into DSTs with no debt, you definitely have that option. We have a number of DSTs at any given time that have 0 debt. But here's something that I want to point out. If you get into a DST that has 50% debt, and most apartment DSTs do have debt, I mentioned that's the most popular asset class. So let's suppose you want to invest in an apartment that has a 50% debt to equity ratio. You take your $1 million and you invest it in that DST. you're now going to be buying $2 million of property. $1 million of that's going to come from the equity you own, and the other $1 million of that property is going to come from the bank loan that's in existence. So what does that do for you? Well, it gives you some debt, and if you don't like debt, that may not be a good thing, but it gives you something else that's really, really helpful, and that is you pick up another $1 million of value that you can now depreciate. So your depreciation write-offs at the end of the year will go up substantially because you've leveraged debt, and 50% is not a crazy amount of debt. If it was for 70 or 80 or 90%, I would get really nervous talking to customers or clients about getting into too much debt over their head. But 50% on a good cash flowing apartment is a pretty modest amount, conservative amount of debt, and you pick up all of this additional real estate that you're now able to write off at the end of the year. Also, you can write off the interest expense on the mortgage. Even though you're not responsible for the mortgage, you can write off, and many times we see the tax shelter on DSTs approach 100%. So you put most of that income, if not all that income, in your pocket at the end of the year.
It's important to remember that when they get out of their house or whatever they're selling, that's debt that they are responsible for. But when they get into the DST, it's non-recourse debt. So it's not the same thing as having debt, in a way.
From a liability standpoint, you're not a guarantor on the DST, the trustee is. So that's a real good point.
Perfect. Awesome. Okay, we do have another question from Eunice. She's asking, when the DST is being sold, can the investor find another DST for their next 1031 exchange?
Yeah, so.
Yes, they can. You can trade any kind of real estate that you have, whether it's a DST or another thing, that you can get 1031 exchanges. I mean, the beautiful part of DSTs that I think need to be emphasized is that you might have it for about 7 years, and then you can sell it, and then you can trade it into another DST or two at the time. The beautiful thing about DSTs, especially for senior citizens, is that I think they're a lot easier to work with in your estate planning. Because if you have 3 or 4 heirs, you're not leaving a confusing estate to the heirs to work with. The DST can be broken up into individual DST amounts for each of your heirs. So it's a real great tool for solving estate planning problems. You know, the fun thing to remember is that when you take on a DST, you're joining a check a month club. No tenants, no toilets, no trash. And that's really the benefit of using the DSTs compared to anything else, and particularly true for senior citizens.
Very good. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ralph and Paul. Okay, so I think that's about all of our questions for now for today, and I'll go ahead and wrap our presentation up. We do have another incredible speaker event this month on COVID-19 and its impact on the local real estate market and economy by our Santa Clara County Assessor, Larry Stone, next Tuesday at 5:30 p.m. So feel free to leave also in the chat box any additional topics that you guys are interested in, and we'll be sure to go ahead and find the best speakers for that specific topic. Here again, please go ahead and contact Paul and Ralph directly for any of your own or clients' needs. We'll be sending out this presentation as well as the recording for everybody first thing tomorrow morning. So let's go ahead and close with a special thank you to Paul Getty and Ralph Bunje for sharing some great information today. And thank you everyone for your participation. Have a great rest of your week and stay safe.
Stay healthy, guys. See ya.
Take care.
Yeah.